I am sitting at my desk in London, staring at my laptop, sipping the world's tiniest flat white, and seriously wondering whether I need to pack my bags and move back to Ohio. Not because anything dramatic happened, not because I got fired, but because about 10 minutes ago, I experienced the most uniquely British form of psychological warfare I have ever encountered. I have been living in the UK for almost 2 years now, which is long enough to think I understood the rules. I know how to tap my card on the tube without causing a scene. I know that pants means underwear, not trousers. I know that on public transport, eye contact is basically an act of aggression. I know how to pronounce Leicester, even though it looks like it should be pronounced by a medieval wizard. I thought I was adapting. And then today, I sent a completely normal office-wide email. Boring, lifeless, corporate. Just a quick note about an upcoming software update. I wrote the word program, Program. I hit send. 2 minutes later, my boss replies to everyone with one immaculate sentence. Thanks for the update, Olivia. We'll review the program shortly. Program. With the extra M, with the silent E, with that smug little ornamental tail hanging off the end like it pays council tax. And the crazy part is, she did not actually correct me. She never said, by the way, in British English, it's program. She did something so much worse. She demonstrated the spelling in public, calmly, elegantly, in front of the whole department. It was not a correction. It was a linguistic execution carried out with perfect office manners. That was the moment I realized something important. Americans and British people are not just speaking different versions of English. We are engaged in a quiet, centuries-long war over what English is supposed to be. And every single day, Americans abroad are getting politely destroyed in the trenches. Because that is the thing Americans do not fully understand until they live here. In the US, if someone corrects your spelling, they are usually being annoying. It is direct, it is obvious. We call them the grammar police and move on. But in Britain, correction is an art form. It is never loud. It arrives wrapped in politeness, soft enough that you do not even realize you have been insulted until 3 hours later when you are replaying the conversation in the shower. And once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. It is everywhere. In emails, in meetings, in grocery stores, in pubs, in tiny remarks that sound harmless until your brain catches up and realizes you have just been spiritually slapped with a lace glove. And honestly, this is exactly why I love making these videos. Because once you start pulling on one tiny thread, like why British people write program like it's wearing a waistcoat, you end up uncovering this entire unhinged history of class, empire, ogo, and linguistic warfare. And there are so many stories like this that never make it into the main video. So, tiny side note, if you're the kind of person who likes the deeper rabbit hole stuff, the extra behind the scenes breakdowns, the cut stories, and the more unfiltered versions of these conversations, that's exactly what the channel membership is for. It's basically the cozy corner of this channel for people who want more than just the main upload. More deep dives, more niche stories, more of the little details I find, and then immediately become way too obsessed with. So if you watch these videos and always think, okay, but now I want the messier version with all the extra context, you'd probably love it over there. Anyway, back to the language war. The weirdest part is that Americans have this story in our heads about the English language. We think we cleaned it up, we think we streamlined it, we think we looked at all the extra vowels and decorative spellings and said, absolutely not, we are a practical people. We modernized the language, we fixed the mess, and the British look at that story the way you would look at a child proudly announcing that they have improved the Mona Lisa by giving her sunglasses. They do not get mad, they get sympathetic. They look at your spelling the way a vet looks at a limping dog. But here is the thing. The more I got corrected, the more irritated I got. And the more irritated I got, the deeper I went down this ridiculous historical rabbit hole. I started reading about dictionaries, spelling reforms, dead presidents, Oxford slang, French invasions, and one deeply dramatic chemist named Humphrey Davy, and what I found completely changed the way I think about all of this. Because the story the British love to tell, and honestly the story Americans half believe too, is that we spell differently because we are lazy. We dropped letters because we could not be bothered. But that is not what happened. A lot of these differences were deliberate, political, ideological. In some cases, they were basically linguistic rebellion. But before we get to the man who weaponized the dictionary, we have to talk about the single funniest spelling disaster in American history. Because my little program humiliation today is nothing compared to what happened when an actual president of the United States tried to reform the English language and got bullied into surrender by a bunch of smug British newspapers. We have to talk about Teddy Roosevelt. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is not a man you normally associate with spelling reform. He is hunting, boxing, charging up hills, building national parks. Teddy Roosevelt. And yet in 1906, Roosevelt backed something called the Simplified Spelling Board. This board was funded by Andrew Carnegie, who apparently woke up one day, looked at the English language, and decided that what the world really needed was a hostile takeover of vowels. Their mission was to simplify English spelling by force, not over centuries, immediately, and some of their ideas were fine. Through becomes through, maybe manageable. But then they started getting high on their own supply. Kissed became kissed. Blushed became blushed. They had hundreds of words they wanted to fix, and Roosevelt loved it. He thought this was efficient. Modern. American. Why waste ink? Why waste time? Why keep fossilized letters hanging around in perfectly good words? So he actually ordered the government printing office to use these simplified spellings in official documents. The President of the United States looked at the English language and thought, yes, I personally will sort this out. And the backlash was immediate. Congress hated it. The public mocked it. But the British press had the time of their lives. They did not rage. They did something far more devastating. They made fun of him with the kind of leisurely aristocratic contempt that only Britain can produce. They wrote satirical pieces. They mocked the spellings. They treated the whole thing like America had found a crayon and started scribbling on civilization. Roosevelt was not just opposed, he was laughed out of the room. Eventually, he had to back down. The order was withdrawn. The great American spelling revolution collapsed, and the British won that round exactly the way they always seem to win these little cultural skirmishes, by acting as though they are not emotionally invested at all, while clearly enjoying every second of your humiliation. And honestly, that energy is still alive. You can feel it in modern Britain every single time an American says math instead of maths. I learnt this the hard way in a pub in Soho. I was out with a few British friends, and at some point I casually said, I was never good at math in high school. The table went quiet in that unmistakable British way where nobody makes a scene, but suddenly the air changes. One of my friends, Tom, looked at me over his pint and said, "You mean maths?" Now, I was ready for this. I had an argument. The American position is actually pretty simple. Mathematics is a field of study. It is treated as a singular discipline. We do not say I am bad at chemistries. We do not say I studied biologies. So why would we abbreviate mathematics as though it were plural? Math makes sense. Clean, efficient, logical. I explained all of this with the confidence of a woman who thought she was about to score an international diplomatic point. Tom listened, nodded, took a sip of his beer, then said, "Right, well, maths is just the standard abbreviation here, but I suppose math is a lovely simple version." A lovely simple version. That line hit me like a sniper shot from the 18th century, because that is what British linguistic superiority sounds like. Not "you're wrong," not "that's stupid," something much colder. They let you make your case, they hear your evidence, and then they dismiss it with the verbal equivalent of patting a farm animal. And the truth is, fights like math versus maths are never really about one word. They are about status, ownership, cultural hierarchy. Every time a British person corrects an American over Lego or maths or aluminium, what they are really saying is not, "Here is the correct spelling." What they are saying is, "You are a tenant in a house we built," which brings us to the man who saw that house and decided to remodel it with an axe. Noah Webster. If you grew up in America, Webster is just a dictionary name. He feels neutral, educational. But Noah Webster was not neutral. He was one of the most aggressively patriotic language nerds in history. This is the period just after the American Revolution. The colonies had won independence militarily, but Webster thought the country still sounded British. That bothered him. He believed that as long as Americans used British spelling and British language standards, they were still mentally tied to the old world. Political independence was not enough. America, in his view, needed intellectual independence too. So Webster set out to create a distinctly American standard of English. He wrote dictionaries, he wrote school books, and more importantly, he started cutting letters out of British words like he was settling a personal score. This is why Americans have color instead of color, honor instead of honor, favor instead of favor. The British love to act like we dropped the U because we were too lazy to carry it. But Webster did not remove those letters by accident. He hated what they represented. Those spellings had become tied up with British tradition, French influence, and aristocratic taste. He wanted English that felt republican, practical, and independent. And once you see it that way, American spelling starts to look less like laziness and more like revolution by stationery. Because even the history behind the U is funny. Those words did not originally need it. Their deeper roots come from Latin forms like color and honor. No U. Then the Norman conquest happens. French influence floods into England, and suddenly the spellings start getting dressed up. Extra vowels, fancy endings, upper-class prestige. The British establishment embraces it because of course they do. Then along comes Samuel Johnson in the 18th century, the great architect of British dictionary authority, and he basically locks those ornate spellings in place. Colour stays, honour stays, centre stays, theatre stays, defence stays. The language becomes a museum. And Noah Webster looked at that museum and said, why are we preserving all of this inherited clutter? Why are we spelling words to impress dead Frenchmen? So he flips centre to centre, theatre to theatre, defence to defence, programme to programme. He is not just shortening words, he is rejecting a worldview. He is saying America does not need to sound noble, it needs to work. That is why I love him, also because he was completely unhinged. Webster had good ideas, and then he had ideas that sound like the result of a fever. He wanted women to become women. He wanted ache to become a K. He wanted soup to become soup. So yes, even the Americans of the early republic had to look him in the eye and say, Noah, we respect the patriotism, but we will not be ordering chicken soup in public. So American spelling became a compromise. We kept the reforms that felt intuitive and useful. We ditched the ones that made us sound like we had all suffered a head injury. But the break had happened. British and American English were now visibly different, and both sides started treating those differences like personality traits. To Britain, their spellings were continuity, heritage, tradition, proof that they were connected to history and literary prestige. To America, simplified spellings became a tiny expression of national character, efficient, forward-looking, practical, a tool, not an heirloom. But just when you think this story is about America changing English, you discover the twist that makes this whole debate unbelievably satisfying. In a shocking number of cases, the Americans did not change the original English at all. The British did. Take the word soccer. Americans get roasted constantly for saying soccer. Every few months, some man in a football shirt acts like the word was invented in a suburban strip mall in Ohio. But the word soccer is British, not just British. Elite British, Oxford British. In the late 19th century, there were different forms of football being played in England, rugby football and association football. At Oxford, students had this habit of shortening words. Rugby became rugger, association became soccer. It was upper-class slang, British slang. America just adopted it because we already had a sport called football. The British handed us the word, we kept using it, and then later Britain drifted back toward football. And now they mock us for preserving their own slang. That is not grammar. That is gaslighting with a monarchy. The same thing happens with fall and autumn. Every time I say fall in Britain, people react like I just named the season after the intellectual process of tripping. Except fall is Old English usage. It was normal in Britain. The colonists brought it to America. Britain later drifted toward autumn because autumn sounded nicer, more refined, more continental. So again, the British changed their own usage, and then they act like Americans are uncivilized for keeping the older version. And then there is the heavyweight champion of this entire argument, aluminum. If you want to make a British person blink slowly and prepare for combat, just say aluminum and keep going. They cannot help themselves, they hear aluminum the way a music teacher hears a wrong note. But the history of this word is absurd. The element was named by Sir Humphrey Davy, a British chemist, and during the naming process, one of the forms he used was aluminum. The supposedly barbaric American version was used by the British scientist who discovered the thing. America took that spelling and held on to it. Britain later shifted toward aluminium because members of the British scientific establishment felt it sounded more in line with other elements like sodium and potassium. In other words, they changed it because vibes, because symmetry, because it felt more classical. And now modern British people say aluminium with the serene confidence of people guarding sacred truth, when in reality they are defending a later stylistic revision. Even the letter Z gets dragged into this. Americans write realize, organize, apologize with a Z. Many British people prefer realize, organize, apologize with an S. And if you use the Z in certain British workplaces, people look at you like you wrote the email while eating crayons. But the -ize ending has deep roots, tracing back through Greek. Oxford, of all places, traditionally supports the Z in many of those words. Yet somehow the American using a Z is treated like a linguistic criminal. At a certain point, you realize this debate is not really about correctness. It is about identity. British English carries itself like an old aristocratic estate, beautiful in parts, full of weird rooms that do not make sense, plumbing that should have been replaced in 1890, and a deeply held belief that inconvenience is proof of character. Why spell Leicester the way it sounds when you can make outsiders suffer? Why use program when program can stand there in a waistcoat, reminding everyone that time is not the point? American English, by contrast, feels like a power tool. If the handle is awkward, sand it down. If a letter is useless, remove it. If a spelling looks like it was designed for a duke, simplify it until it can survive a newspaper headline and a public school classroom. And once I understood that, all these little moments in Britain started making more sense. The first time I wrote check instead of check in front of an estate agent, she looked down at the paper, then up at me and said, "Oh, an American check. How delightfully phonetic." At the time, I smiled. I think I may even thanked her. It was only later that I realized what had happened. She had called me simple, with charm, with grace, with a little sigh, carrying centuries of imperial fatigue. That is what makes British correction so dangerous. It has a delayed fuse. You do not feel the explosion right away. And here is the most demoralizing part. The British are fundamentally unmoved by evidence. You can bring historical documents, you can explain Noah Webster, you can mention Humphrey Davy, you can tell them soccer came from Oxford and that foal is older English and that even Oxford spelling prefers the zid in certain words. And they will still just tilt their heads and say yes, but it's just not right, is it? That sentence contains the entire philosophy, because to many British people, English is not a system to be optimized. It is a social instinct, a cultural inheritance. They do not need you to prove their spelling is logical. Logic is not the point. Familiarity is the point. Birthright is the point. And as an American living here, that is the hardest thing to accept. There is no final debate you can win. No conclusive argument that makes everyone clap and admit. Webster had a point. You cannot logic somebody out of a feeling they inherited with tea, weather complaints, and school uniforms. So what happens instead is something much worse. You start changing, you start absorbing it. Last week I caught myself writing color on my grocery list. Not in an email, not in a shared document, on my own private grocery list. I put the U in, I looked at it, I hated it, and yet part of me thought, that does look a little elegant. It looks like the word has somewhere nice to be after this. That was when I knew the psychological warfare was working. And then came today, Programgate, my boss's reply all performance. I sat there for 20 minutes, drafting possible responses in my head. I wanted to explain the Norman conquest. I wanted to drag Noah Webster into the office by force of spirit and have him throw tea into the Thames on principle. I wanted to write back, actually. The simplified American form reflects a broader democratic and anti-aristocratic reform movement in post-revolutionary lexicography. But of course I could not do that, because then I would lose, not linguistically, socially. And that is when I understood the only way to survive this country. You do not resist the politeness, you weaponize it. So I hit reply all, and I wrote, "Thank you so much for the clarification. I'm looking forward to reviewing the program. It's always so fascinating to see how the traditional spellings have been preserved over here. Have a lovely afternoon." But that is it. That is all I wrote. On the surface, completely gracious, warm, curious, appreciative, but underneath it, oh, underneath it was venom in a cashmere sweater. Because what was I really saying? I was saying your spelling is historically interesting in the way a steam engine is historically interesting. Charming, preserved, traditional, a relic. I did not fight the weapon. I picked it up and fired it back. And 5 minutes later, my boss walked past my desk. She did not mention the email. She did not stop. She just gave me a tight smile, nodded once, and kept walking. And in that tiny moment, I knew I had done it. I had finally spoken fluent British. Not the vocabulary, not the spelling, the energy. That closed mouth smile was not defeat exactly. It was recognition, a silent acknowledgement that I had learnt the local customs. I may still say math, I may still say soccer, I may still refuse on moral grounds to pronounce aluminium like I'm narrating a fantasy audiobook. But I now understand the real rule of this island. The point is never to win the argument. The point is to make the other person feel the weight of your civility. And honestly, I do not know whether that realization means I am adapting beautifully or becoming a monster. Maybe both, because now when someone corrects my spelling, I do not feel panic. I feel strategy. So yes, technically, I am still living in London. Technically, I am still outnumbered by unnecessary vowels and suspicious R's. Technically, I am still one pub conversation away from being gently informed that the word math is barbaric and that Lego is somehow singular, no matter how many pieces are on the floor. But I am no longer defenseless. Because now I know the history, I know that American spelling was not just laziness, it was rebellion. I know that some of the words Britain mocks us for are words Britain invented, changed, or abandoned first. I know that language is not just grammar, it is identity, ego, class, memory, and sometimes a very old empire trying not to admit that its children rearranged the furniture and some of the changes were improvements. So the next time somebody looks over my shoulder and gently preserves a traditional spelling in front of me, I will not flinch. I will not ramble. I will smile. I will thank them. And I will say, with all the warmth and precision of a woman who has been forged in the office kitchens and pub corners of modern Britain, how lovely. I always find these traditional forms so fascinating. Then I will take a sip of my absurdly small flat white, return to my desk and continue typing program without the me, color without the U, and realize with a Z, because I may be an American expat swimming in a sea of decorative letters, but I am learning, I am evolving, I am becoming dangerous. Still, let me be clear about one thing. If one more man in tweed corrects me on maths, I really might lose my mind.